The reflection on the black marble was perfect. So perfect, Lena could see the faint shimmer of dust motes dancing in the afternoon light pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She could also see the reflections of the three women arranged artfully on the white leather sofa behind her. Tiffany, with her platinum hair and surgically sharpened features, Amber, whose fiery red curls were a carefully curated statement, and Brittany, all sun-kissed skin and practiced nonchalance. They were beautiful, expensive, and utterly unaware of her existence beyond her function. To them, she was just a pair of hands in a dark blue uniform, a silent entity ensuring the glass beneath their champagne flutes remained spotless. Lena's own reflection was a muted counterpoint. Her dark skin absorbed the light rather than bouncing it back. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, tight bun, not a single coil out of place. Her expression, as always, was a carefully constructed blank slate. She was 20 years old, and she had mastered the art of invisibility. It was the most important skill for survival in this house. The atmosphere in the penthouse living room shifted before a sound was made. It was a drop in temperature, a sudden density to the air that made the dust motes cease their dance. The three women felt it, their light chatter faltering. They sat up a little straighter. Jin-Woo Kwon entered the room. He moved like the world owed him space, and the world always paid its debts. He wasn't a large man, but his presence filled the vast, minimalist space. His suit was a deep charcoal Tom Ford, tailored so precisely it looked less like clothing and more like a second skin. His white shirt was stark against the tan of his throat.
He wore no tie.
There was nothing to distract from the cold, absolute certainty in his eyes. They were dark, intelligent, and missed nothing. He didn't acknowledge the women on the sofa. His gaze swept the room, a silent inventory of his domain, and landed, for a fraction of a second, on Lena. It wasn't a look of recognition. It was the look a predator gives its territory, ensuring everything is exactly as it should be. She felt it like a physical touch, a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She kept her head down, her cloth moving in slow, even circles on the marble. "I've grown bored," he announced to the room. His voice was quiet, a low baritone that carried no hint of emotion, yet it commanded the absolute attention of everyone present. He walked to the large table she was polishing and placed a thin, lacquered box upon it. He opened the lid. Inside, nestled on black velvet, were 4 credit cards. They were matte black, heavy, made of some kind of metal. They bore no numbers, only his family crest, a stylized dragon coiled around a plum blossom, embossed in silver. Tiffany leaned forward, a predatory gleam in her blue eyes. "Jin-Woo, darling, what's this?" "A game," he said, his eyes still roaming the room before settling on the cards. "A test of ambition, of taste, of understanding." He picked up one of the cards and held it between his index and middle fingers. "These cards have no limit. I want each of you to take one. You have 24 hours to make a single purchase. Something that you believe will impress me." A thrill went through the three women. Amber giggled, a breathy, excited sound. Brittany was already pulling out her phone, no doubt scrolling through a mental catalog of luxury goods. This was a language they understood, a competition they were born to win. Jin-Woo extended the first card to Tiffany. She took it with manicured nails, her smile sharp. He gave the second to Amber, the third to Brittany. They held them like trophies. One card remained in the box. Lena continued her work, her movements economical and silent. She was a ghost, a piece of the furniture. She was preparing to retreat to the kitchens when his voice cut through the air, stopping her cold. "Lena." She froze. He had never addressed her by name before. It was always a clipped "you," or a gesture to one of his other staff. Her heart gave a single, hard thud against her ribs. Slowly, she straightened up and turned to face him, keeping her eyes fixed on the knot of a non-existent tie at his throat. Looking him in the eye was a mistake she had learned on her first day. "Sir?" Her voice was a low murmur, respectful and empty. He picked up the final black card from its velvet bed. The silence in the room was now heavy, confused. Tiffany exchanged a bewildered, scornful look with Brittany. He held the card out to Lena. Her mind went completely blank. She stared at the black rectangle in his hand. It looked like a weapon, a trap, a brand. Her hands, hidden in the folds of her white apron, clenched into fists.
"Take it," he said. "It was not a request."
"Sir, I couldn't," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "I am your maid." "I am aware of your position," he said, his voice dropping even lower, colder. "It does not make you deaf or disobedient. This is a test for 4 women. You are the 4th. The humiliation was a hot flush on her cheeks. She was being made a spectacle, a pawn in some cruel game for his amusement and the amusement of his girlfriends. She could feel their eyes on her, dissecting her, dismissing her. The girl in the cheap uniform, the help. What could she possibly buy? A new mop. She still didn't move. Her refusal was a tiny, silent rebellion, the only power she had. He took a step closer. The air displaced by his movement was scented with something clean and sharp, like cedar and cold smoke. He was close enough now that she had to tilt her head back slightly to keep her gaze on his throat. "Consider it part of your duties, Lena," he murmured, his voice so low it was a vibration against her skin, meant for her alone. "Do not disappoint me." That was the moment everything changed. The word disappoint in his mouth was not about feelings. It was about consequences. It was a threat wrapped in the guise of a challenge. The choice was an illusion. It had always been an illusion. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached out and took the card. It was heavier than she expected and cold as ice. Its surface was smooth, flawless. The weight of it in her palm felt like the weight of a life. Her life. She risked a glance up, and for the first time, she met his eyes. They were not just dark. They were absolute. And in their depths, she saw a flicker of something she couldn't name. It wasn't cruelty. It was a terrifying, calculating curiosity. He was watching her, waiting to see what the strange, new piece on his board would do. The weight of the card in her uniform pocket was a constant, pressing reminder of the impossible task ahead. All through the next morning, as she dusted priceless antiques and laundered silk sheets, the other women's excited, plotting voices echoed through the mansion. Tiffany was on the phone with a bespoke jeweler, discussing a rare, canary yellow diamond. Brittany was arranging a down payment on a limited edition Lamborghini. Amber was trying to buy a walk-on role in an upcoming blockbuster, a purchase of influence rather than object. Their choices were so predictable. They were buying status, luxury, things that would tether them more tightly to Jean Woo's world of obscene wealth. They were trying to prove they belonged there. Lena knew she did not belong. She was an anomaly, a variable he had thrown into his equation for reasons she couldn't fathom. And that made her dangerous to them, and even more dangerous to herself. She knew she was being watched, not just by the other women, but by Jean Woo's men. The silent guards at the gate, the driver who would take her wherever she chose to go. This wasn't about freedom, it was about observation.
He wasn't testing her taste.
He was dissecting her soul. When her duties were finished, she changed out of her uniform into a simple pair of black jeans and a gray t-shirt. She looked at herself in the small mirror in her staff quarters. She looked like what she was, a young woman who was in far over her head. Taking a deep breath, she walked out to the waiting car, a black Mercedes with tinted windows. The driver, a stoic man named Mr. Choi, simply nodded at her. Where to, miss? She didn't choose Rodeo Drive or the luxury car dealerships. She gave him the address of a neighborhood on the other side of the city, a place of cracked sidewalks, vibrant murals, and the distant, constant wail of sirens. It was a place she knew from a life before this one. As the Mercedes glided through the bustling streets, Lena watched the city change. The gleaming towers of glass and steel gave way to brick storefronts with hand-painted signs and community gardens squeezed into vacant lots. She felt a knot in her stomach loosen, just a fraction. This felt real. The air here was thick with the smells of street food and exhaust fumes, not the sterile, recycled air of the penthouse. She had Mr. Choi park a few blocks away and told him she would walk. He hesitated, his eyes flicking to the rear-view mirror. Mr. Kwan's orders were to stay with you. Mr. Kwan's orders were a test, she replied, her voice steady. If you're standing over my shoulder, it's not my choice, is it? I'll be back in an hour.
He didn't argue.
He simply gave a stiff nod. She knew he would be watching from a distance. As she walked, she felt it, a prickling on the back of her neck, the feeling of being followed. It was different from the professional, unobtrusive watch of Jin Woo's men. This was heavier, more predatory. She glanced at her reflection in a shop window and saw it, a black sedan, crawling along the curb half a block behind her. It wasn't one of Jin Woo's. The license plate was unfamiliar. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her resolve. This was the other side of his world. The part that didn't involve champagne and designer dresses. This was the part with consequences. She ducked into a crowded indoor market, the air suddenly thick with the scent of spices and fresh produce. She moved quickly, weaving through shoppers, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was competent under pressure. She slipped through a side exit into a narrow alleyway, scraping her arm against the rough brick, and emerged onto a different street, melting into the crowd heading for the subway. She lost them, but the fear remained, a cold residue on her skin. She had been seen, identified, marked as belonging to him. She returned to the mansion late in the afternoon, her nerves frayed. The house was quiet. She went to the kitchen to get a glass of water, her hand trembling slightly. As she passed the main study, she saw the door was ajar. Jin Woo was inside. He was standing with his back to her, looking at a small, silver frame on his desk. His posture, usually so unyieldingly rigid, had a different quality. A subtle slump in his shoulders, a stillness that wasn't about power, but about pain. He didn't seem to have noticed her. Curiosity warred with self-preservation, and for a dangerous moment, curiosity won. She pushed the door open a few more inches. The photograph was of a young woman, barely out of her teens, with Jin Woo's dark eyes and a bright, rebellious smile that he himself never wore. "My sister," he said, without turning around. He had known she was there all along. Her name was Sum. Lena said nothing. She stood in the doorway, a silent witness. She was stubborn, he continued, his voice a low, rough thing she'd never heard before. And principled. She hated what her father did. What I do. She thought she could save the world, he paused, his fingers tracing the edge of the silver frame. A rival family thought she was my weakness. They took her to get to me. I made a mistake. A tactical error. I was too slow. He stopped speaking, but the words hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. I failed to protect her. That was his wound. The one vulnerability he carried. He finally turned, his face a mask of cold control again, but his eyes held the ghost of that old pain. His gaze fell on her arm, where a thin, red scratch from the alley wall stood out against her dark skin. Before she could react, he crossed the space between them in 2 silent strides. He reached out and took her arm. His touch was not gentle, but it wasn't rough either. It was deliberate, clinical. His thumb brushed over the scratch, sending a jolt of unexpected heat through her. It was a small, almost deniable gesture, but from a man who commanded legions with a flick of his wrist, it was a seismic event. The air in the room grew thick, charged with something unspoken. His eyes locked on hers, and for the first time, she felt like he was seeing her Lena, not just the maid or the pawn in his game. He dropped her arm as if it were burning, his expression shuddering closed. "Be more careful," he said, his voice clipped. "This world is not forgiving of scrapes and bruises." He was not just talking about her arm. He was talking about the black sedan, about his sister, about the price of proximity to him. And she understood, with a terrifying clarity, that she had just stepped from the edge of his world into its violent, unforgiving center. The next day, the atmosphere in the penthouse was thick with anticipation. It felt like the prelude to an execution. Tiffany, Amber, and Brittany arrived together, a united front of Chanel, Dior, and condescension. They laid their spoils on the black marble table like offerings to a god. Tiffany went first. With a flourish, she presented a velvet box. Inside, a necklace glittered, a canary diamond the size of a robin's egg suspended from a chain of white gold. A one-of-a-kind piece, she announced. An investment. Amber was next. She slid a set of car keys and a thick contract across the table. A deposit on the new Aston Martin Vulcan. There are only 24 in the world. Brittany smiled, holding up her phone to show a series of documents. I purchased a controlling interest in a new, exclusive social media platform. Influence is the only currency that matters. They all looked at Jinwoo, their eyes hungry for approval. He regarded their purchases with an unnerving lack of expression. His gaze was flat, analytical. He looked at the diamond, the keys, the digital contract, and then his eyes lifted, finding Lena where she stood silently by the door. "And you?" he asked, his voice cutting through their self-congratulatory chatter. The three women turned, their expressions ranging from pity to contempt. Lena walked forward. She carried no shopping bags, no velvet boxes. Her hands were empty. She stopped before the table and placed a single, folded document on the polished marble. It was a deed. Jinwoo picked it up. His eyes scanned the legal language, his brow furrowing slightly. Tiffany laughed, a brittle, ugly sound. "What is that? Did you buy a closet?" "It's a building," Lena said, her voice quiet but clear. "A community center. In the Westlake district." The room went silent. Amber stared, her mouth slightly agape. Brittany looked utterly bewildered. This was a move so far outside their understanding of the game that it didn't compute. Jinwoo looked up from the paper, his dark eyes fixed on her. "Explain." "The building was foreclosed on," she said, choosing her words with care. "It used to be a youth center, a safe place. After it shut down, gang recruitment in the area went up 30%. The card paid for the building and for a blind trust to fund its complete renovation and operation for the next 50 years. It will have after-school programs, job training, a legal aid clinic." He said nothing. He simply stared at her, his face an unreadable mask. He was looking at her as if he'd never seen a human being before. No one had ever used his power for something that wasn't for themselves. They used it to acquire, to possess, to elevate their own status. She had used it to build something, to protect others. In his world of calculated self-interest, her move was an act of profound, almost insane, rebellion. She hadn't tried to impress him with what she could own. She had shown him what she valued. That was when the first gunshot shattered the silence and the window behind him. Chaos erupted. The three women screamed, diving for cover. Jinwoo moved with a lethal grace that was terrifying to behold. He had a gun in his hand before the first shard of glass hit the floor, pulling Lena behind him, his body a solid shield in front of hers. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a low growl. More shots followed, peppering the room. His men, his soldiers, materialized from the hallways, returning fire with disciplined precision. It wasn't a full-scale assault.
It was a targeted strike.
A message. The rival faction, the ones whose men had followed her, were making their move. They had seen her as a new variable, and now they were trying to eliminate her or what she represented. During a lull in the gunfire, one of the attackers, clad in black, burst through a side door, catching them in a crossfire. He had his weapon leveled directly at Jinwoo's back. There was no time. Jinwoo was focused on the threat at the window. Lena's mind went white with a single, overriding instinct. She didn't scream. She didn't freeze. She acted. Her eyes landed on a heavy, abstract marble sculpture on a nearby pedestal. Without a second thought, she lunged for it, her muscles screaming with the effort of lifting the solid stone. She swung it with all her might, bringing it down on the side of the attacker's head. There was a sickening crack. He crumpled to the floor, unconscious. The room fell silent again, save for the ragged sound of her own breathing. She stood over the fallen man, the sculpture still clutched in her hands, her knuckles white. She had just crossed a line. A profound, unerasable line. The shock of it washed over her, cold and dizzying. But beneath the shock, There was no regret. There was only the stark, terrifying truth. She had done it to save him. Jin-woo turned, his eyes taking in the scene, the downed man, the weapon in her hands, her wide, stunned eyes. His expression was impossible to read. Later, after the bodies had been removed and the broken glass swept away, the mansion was cloaked in a heavy, watchful silence. Tiffany, Amber, and Brittany were gone, whisked away by security to some undisclosed location. Lena knew she would never see them again. They were loose ends, liabilities from a life he was already shedding. She was in study, dabbing the cut on her arm with an antiseptic wipe from a first aid kit. Her hands were still shaking. Jin-woo entered, closing the door behind him. He had taken off his jacket. His white shirt was stained with a smear of someone else's blood. He walked to the bar and poured 2 glasses of whiskey, his movements precise and controlled. He set one down in front of her. He watched her for a long moment, the silence stretching between them until it was a physical thing. "You shouldn't have done that," he said finally, his voice low. "He was going to shoot you," she replied, her voice hoarse. "Others would have handled it. They weren't going to be fast enough," she met his gaze, refusing to look away. "You would be dead." He took a step closer, crowding her space, the scent of cedar, smoke, and now gunpowder, surrounding her. "Why?" he asked, the single word loaded with 1,000 questions. Why risk herself? Why not just hide? Why protect him? The answer was there, sitting heavy and dangerous in her chest, an answer she hadn't even admitted to herself until this moment. She told herself it was survival. She told herself it was instinct. But she was lying. "I don't know," she whispered, which was the truest lie of all. He reached out, his fingers gently touching her chin, tilting her face up to his. His eyes searched hers, looking for something. "You are a complication I did not anticipate, Lena." It wasn't a declaration of love. It was something far more dangerous. It was an admission, an acknowledgement that she had breached his defenses, that she had become a factor in his ice-cold calculations that he could no longer control or predict. In his world, that was the most intimate confession he could possibly make. The tension between them was no longer just fear or proximity. It was a live wire, sparking in the space between their bodies, and she knew, with a sinking certainty, that if either of them moved, they would both be consumed by the flame. The enemy had made their move, and they had failed. But they had learned something vital. They had seen Jin-woo Kwon shield his maid with his own body. They had seen where his eyes went first when the shooting started. They had identified his new weakness. The message came 2 nights later. Not a call, but a delivery. A single white gardenia left on the mansion's doorstep. The signature of the rival boss, a man named Park. It was the same kind of flower Park had left as a calling card before he'd taken Sumin. Tucked into its petals was a small, high-resolution photograph. It was of the community center. Her community center. It was a clear, unmistakable threat. "We know what you value. We know how to hurt you." Jin-woo's rage was a terrifying thing. It wasn't loud or explosive. It was a sudden, profound drop in the atmospheric pressure of the mansion, a stillness so absolute it felt like the air had frozen solid. He stared at the photograph, his jaw so tight a muscle jumped along the bone. He was planning a war. Lena watched him from the doorway of his study. She could see the tactical mind at work, the cold fury being channeled into strategy. He would go after Park. He would burn his rival's empire to the ground. But she knew that in a war like this, the first casualties are the things people love. She could have stayed quiet. She could have let him protect her, let his soldiers handle it. That was the role she was supposed to play. But she was not Sumin. She would not be a vulnerability he had to avenge. She would be a weapon he could wield. Over the past weeks, cleaning every inch of this fortress, she had learned its secrets. The blind spots in the security cameras. The maintenance tunnels that weren't on any official blueprint. The rotation schedules of the guards. While Jin-woo planned his frontal assault, she made a plan of her own. She did something morally gray, something that crossed a line she could never uncross. Using a burner phone she'd acquired long ago for emergencies, She sent an anonymous tip to the police, not about Park's criminal enterprise, which would be useless, but about a massive, illegal shipment of untaxed luxury goods he was moving through the port that night. It was a crime the authorities would care about, a distraction big enough to pull a significant number of Park's men away from his main compound to deal with the fallout. It was a calculated risk, a betrayal of the underworld's code of silence, but it would divide his forces. It would give Jinwoo an edge. The climax came at midnight. Jinwoo's teams moved out, a silent, lethal convoy disappearing into the city's darkness. He had ordered her to stay in the panic room, the most secure location in the penthouse. She had agreed, with no intention of obeying. The fight at Park's warehouse was brutal and swift. Thanks to Lena's diversion, Park's forces were thinner than expected. Jinwoo's soldiers moved through the compound with surgical precision. But Park was a snake. He had a contingency. As Jinwoo cornered him in his office, Park revealed his trump card. On a large monitor, a live feed showed a room. And in that room, tied to a chair, was Lena.
Park laughed.
You see, Kwon, I learned from your history. You always overcompensate for your last mistake. I knew you'd bring your army here. So I sent one man to the one place you left unguarded. Jinwoo's face went pale. On the screen, a hulking man held a knife to Lena's throat. But Lena was not afraid. She was furious. She had let herself be caught. It was part of her plan. She had allowed the one man Park sent to the mansion to take her, counting on Park's arrogance, on his need to monologue. He's right, Jinwoo, she said, her voice clear and steady through the monitor speaker. You do have a weakness for protecting women. She then turned her eyes to Park. But your weakness is trusting men like your lieutenant, Sangchul.
Park frowned, confused.
The man you sent to guard your shipping containers, Lena continued, her voice cold and cutting. The ones the police are seizing right now. You think it was an anonymous tip? It was him. He's been selling you out for months. He made a deal to take your place. This was his final move. Doubt, venomous and swift, flooded Park's face. He glanced at his own men in the room. Who could he trust? The hesitation lasted only a second. But a second was all Jinwoo needed. The gunshot was a single, sharp crack. It was over. In the aftermath, the silence was absolute. The threat was neutralized. The war was won. Jinwoo returned to the mansion just before dawn. He found her not in the panic room, but in his study, standing before the large window, watching the sun rise over the city. He didn't speak for a long time. He just watched her, his expression a mixture of awe and something that looked dangerously like fear. Not fear of an enemy, but fear of what she represented. They saw you as my weakness, he said finally, his voice raw. He walked to stand beside her, their shoulders almost touching. They were wrong, he paused, turning to face her fully. You are my strength. It was the most honest thing he had ever said. It was his truth laid bare. But this world demanded a price for every victory. The next day, news came that a fire had broken out at the Westlake Community Center. An electrical fault, the official report said. But they both knew it was arson. The last, dying act of a broken enemy. A message. A cost had been paid. The hope she had bought with his money had been turned to ash. She felt the loss like a physical blow, but she did not cry. She had known the rules. Nothing in his world was free. That night, he stood before the vast window again, the city lights a galaxy of captured stars at his feet. He had dismissed his entire staff for the night. They were alone. He didn't ask her to stay. He didn't offer her jewels or cars. He didn't speak of love or forever. Those were words for a different world. He simply held out his hand, palm up. It wasn't a command. It was not the gesture of a boss to his maid. It was an offer, a question, an acknowledgement of a treaty signed in blood and gunfire. Lena looked at her own hands. They were no longer the hands that polished marble and washed away the traces of other people's lives. They were the hands that had wielded a weapon, the hands that had manipulated a war, the hands that had saved the most dangerous man she had ever known. She looked from her hands to his face, to the cold, certain eyes that now looked only at her. She saw the empire he controlled, the violence that upheld it, and the quiet, solitary man at its center. He was a king in a kingdom of shadows, and he was offering her a throne beside him. She walked forward. The fabric of her simple dress whispered against the silence. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, a firm, possessive grip.
A claim.
A choice made without a single word. Outside, the city glittered, oblivious. Inside, in the heart of the empire, a queen had just taken her place.